Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another series of conference by IFI in Human, Territory and Society. Tonight we will welcome Prof. Michel Raymond from IRD CNRS University Montpellier. He has many institutions behind him. And first of all, I would like to thank IRD for the technical assistance, École Française d'Extrême-Orient or EFIO for their main support, and also Komunitas Historia Indonesia. And I would like to remind you that there is the talk of Mr. Raymond and then question and answer, and then after that you could talk with him directly outside with some snacks and drinks. And I would like to talk also about the biography of Michel Raymond. Michel Raymond is a CNRS research director and is the head of the Human Evolutionary Biology team at the Institute of Evolutionary Science in Montpellier. After working on the genetics of adaptation, he is interested in human evolutionary biology, particularly on the evolution of menopause and the study of population polymorphism, such as handedness and sexual orientation. Recently, he is studying local adaptation in the human species, and also he received the silver medal from the CNRS in 1998. So without further ado, please welcome Michel Raymond.
Thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to talk here in Jakarta. So I will talk about local adaptation in humans. But first, a small general introduction. There is a large biodiversity with many different species on Earth, but the point is, if you take several individuals from one species, you will have a polymorphism. Not all individuals are the same, and you have a polymorphism if you take this garden snail, or if you take this moth, which is very famous for the industrial melanism. But any kind of species will give the same result. Several individuals differ if you take a plant, a chimp, a gorilla, or humans. Obviously, in the majority of the case, the diversity is genetics. And in human, it's also cultural. For example, wearing a hat or not, it's not genetic, it's completely cultural. But there are many genetic differences. For example, skin color, the shape of the face, and many others. So the question is, how is this diversity organized? First, the human genome has been sequenced 15 years ago, and we know that it's 3.4 billion per base. But this is for the first individual, but now we have information on many other individuals. For example, 5 years later, the famous 1000 Genome Project, which is quite old now, and there have been many other projects like the UK, the 100,000 Genome Project, and so on, even in Asia. So now we have a pretty good information on the polymorphism, on the genetic polymorphism in humans. And for example, if you take two random individuals, you will have 3 million difference, this is the mean, between the two genomes. So it's a lot, but it's 0.1% of the total genome. So one base every 1000 will differ between two individuals. So now, how is this diversity organized? As you know, the human species came out of Africa between 100 and 200,000 years ago and spread like that on all continents, except Antarctica. I want to develop just 3 points from this migration pattern. The first one is that diversity decreases with distance. If you take Ethiopia as a reference here, this is the distance from Ethiopia. You are at Ethiopia and you are very far from Ethiopia. And this is a measure of the genetic diversity. So a high genetic diversity, but when you go further from Ethiopia, the diversity is decreasing. Why? Only because migration is step by step, and the next step is just a subsample of the local population. So when you repeat this process, you lose genetic diversity along the path. So this is the first point. We have a decrease of diversity from Ethiopia along the migration path. The second point is that when Homo sapiens migrated, it just encountered other human species with whom they could breed. For example, the first encounter was with Neanderthal. And so they breed, and now all the people resulting from this migration here, they have about 3% of their genome with Neanderthal genes. So for example, the Homo sapiens are kept in Africa, they don't have at all any gene of Neanderthal. But after, for this branch going here in Southeast Asia, they encounter Denisova, another species. And now, all the humans derived from this migration, they have 4 to 6% of their genome with Denisova genes. So depending where you are, you can have some Neanderthal, Denisova, or none of them in your genome. This is the second point. And the third one is that the genetic diversity is geographically organized. This is a map of the different countries of Europe, Spain, France, England, and this is an analysis of the general genetic diversity described by several axes, which is quite complicated to explain in detail. But these two axes describe the genetic diversity, and you see that, for example, Spain is here, just you have France, and Switzerland, England, and so on, and in fact, the same geography is retrieved here compared to here. So the main axis of the genetic diversity corresponds to the geographic distribution of individuals. The consequence of this structuration is that if you take a genome and you don't know where it came from, because of the structuration, you can replace this individual at its place of origin with a mistake of few hundred kilometers. So all this bar describes the genetic diversity, and all the information I used to describe all this organization was from neutral genes, which is the majority of all the variations. They are neutral because when you change sometimes one nucleotide, you don't change sometimes the protein, or it's even not in the gene, so there is no change in the phenotype or in the physiology. These are neutral diversity which is used to tell our migratory and demographic history. But now I will talk about a very tiny fraction of the diversity, which is the diversity which is not neutral. This diversity, they change proteins, they change things, and this makes us different genetically. And I will give you some examples of selected genes. The first one will be skin color. This is a map of the UV annual average, and you see that you have more UV in the tropics, you have an effect of mountains, more UV in the mountains, and continental effect, you have more UV on Africa than, for example, in America at the same latitude because of continental effect. What is the effect of UV? UV has bad effects. Okay, you have some cancer of the skin, but it is late in life. The most important thing is that the UV destroys folate. What is folate? Folate is important for nucleotide synthesis. So, you must have a dark skin to protect your folate from UV. But there is also a good aspect of UV. From precursor, it generates the synthesis of vitamin D. And vitamin D is very important for calcium absorption, skeleton development, and so on. So you must have a light color. So you see, because both are important for growth, for example, you must have a balance between the two effects. And we expect skin color to be adjusted depending on the UV conditions to avoid one of the two deleterious effects. So, this is a prediction of skin color according to the distribution of UV. And from what you see, it fits approximately with what we know, but it's possible to have quantitative measure because anthropologists were measuring skin color in every ethnic group on Earth. This is what is observed, and if you do a graph on the predicted value and the observed value, dark color here, light here, if the adjustment was perfect, we expect this line, and you see that some ethnical groups are darker than expected or lighter than expected, but globally the adjustment is quite good. Now let's see how this adjustment has been made. So we made a kind of experiment, just taking a sample here from Africa. We take a sample and we measure the skin color of each individual, and obviously not all skin color are exactly the same, there is a variation. And this local population is adapted to the quantity of UV, and the skin is dark, adjusted to this local concentration of UV. Now, let's make a migration, few hundred kilometers to the north, there is less UV. Now this is a new UV quantity, and most of the population, they are overprotected. So there will be vitamin D deficiencies. And when you have vitamin D deficiency, you have a scurvy. So longevity and fecundity is tremendously decreased. And some people here are just at the right concentration. This means that in few generations, you will have a shift. The one here will be advantages, and the one here, there will be almost no reproduction. So the adaptation now is to the new UV value. Now, if you continue migration towards this, you will have this peak until light skin coloration. So when humans get out of Africa, we know that the skin was dark. There was selection for a light skin color, but now see these ones, they are going there, and after they are going here. So two areas where the UV are stronger and stronger, and so there is a selection for darker skin coloration. But after, when they went to South America, it was the opposite selection, and again selection for light skin coloration. And the same here in Australia. So the observed pattern here is a complex result of selection back and forth toward dark or light coloration. And recent genetic analysis confirmed that the selection was very complex to establish this adaptation. So we can say that skin coloration is a local adaptation to the UV conditions. And this has consequences. Now imagine another kind of migration, a modern migration by plane. So in few hours you can go from Northern Europe to West Africa. So imagine that a pregnant woman from England is going to live in West Africa. Her skin is too light, she's not well protected. So she will have folate deficiencies, and the doctor should complement her for folate. Now, the opposite situation, a pregnant woman from West Africa is going to Northern Europe. She's overprotected and she will have vitamin D deficiency. The same doctor should supplement her with vitamin D. So the consequence of local adaptation is that the doctor won't say the same thing and prescribe the same thing depending on where the patient is and where he is coming from. Okay, this was the first example of a local adaptation, skin coloration. So let's study another example. And this is a picture of the Himalaya from a satellite from the north, and this is the Himalaya plateau, which is more than 3,000 meters high, and the oxygen concentration is decreased by 40%. There are people living there, like the ethnic Sherpa. And if you want to live in this place, be very careful because you are not adapted, and your survival and fecundity will be highly reduced. They are adapted genetically to live in this condition with oxygen production. And in fact, this example has been very fast, and so far it's the fastest evolution seen in humans. In perhaps 1,000 or 1,500 years, they are adapted to this very stressful condition. Interestingly, there are two other places of high altitude where humans have adapted to a low oxygen concentration, in Ethiopia and in the Andes. Obviously, this is three independent events. In the three cases, adaptation was selected for, but the genes involved are different in the three situations. It's convergent evolution. So these are three examples of local adaptation to very specific conditions. So we have seen local adaptation to UV, local adaptation to high altitude. These are kind of climate adaptations. There are many others. I will just mention briefly, for example, adaptation to cold. It's well known in animals that when in cold area, the appendix, the legs and so on of animals are shorter compared to the body. And it's also the same in humans. The anthropologists are describing different types of body shapes, elongated or short. And for example, the Inuit living in very cold area are this kind of body. And for example, the Peul in Africa, this kind of body. So the pattern, this is a rule for mammals and even vertebrates, is also applied to humans. So this is a morphological adaptation to some climatic variables. There are many other types of adaptations. Now let's talk about behavior. And this is the example of the Merapi. So these are the active volcanoes in Indonesia, and this is the Merapi. This is one of the most active volcanoes in the world, with eruption every 2-7 years. And this is the top of the Merapi, and this is the risky area with the lahar and so on. And this is an enlargement of this dangerous area. And you see all these small characters here. These are names of villages. There are many villages in the very risky area. So we have compared people living here and living just outside this risky area, and their behavior toward risk is different, and their genetic composition is also different. And the difference is that a specific gene, the dopamine receptor, known to be involved in risky behaviors. So this was a first short study. So we want to repeat that in the Semeru. That's why all the team is here to go to the Semeru, another very active volcano, to see if it's only the Merapi or if it is more general. And this is a map of the active volcano on Earth. So potentially this kind of local adaptation could be very general for volcanic risks, but also other types of risky environments like tsunami or others. So this was adaptation to risk, and I will just briefly mention another type of behavioral local adaptation, also in Indonesia, published by another team very recently, about the Bajo in Sulawesi. They do underwater fishing a lot, perhaps 10 hours every day, and they can stay underwater 30 minutes. And in fact, their spleen, this is the spleen of an agricultural and the spleen of Bajo people, it's larger, more than 50% higher volume, and this is a similar adaptation of marine mammals, a larger spleen. And this larger spleen is a genetic adaptation. And this has been published this year. So this ethnical group is adapted to a particular behavior, underwater fishing, to get the food. So far it's only two behavioral adaptation known, but this one has been this year and this one 2 years ago. So we expect many more in the future. There are local adaptation to parasites. So when humans colonize several environments with new parasites, well, it developed adaptation to this new parasite. This is a famous example of malaria and resistance to malaria. But there are many other kinds of resistance. For example, fertility. When you have many parasites that kill many children, a higher fertility is seen as an adaptation when you have many parasites. So this is, each point is a country. This is a diversity of parasites, very few parasites, many parasites. And this is human diversity, controlling for many things. So the fertility is increased when the diversity of parasites increases in a given country. Birth weight is also the best predictor of survival of a newborn 1 year later. So when you have many parasites, you better have a birth weight, a higher birth weight to increase survival. And yes, the country with many parasites, the mean birth weight in the country is higher compared to a country where there are less parasites. And this is non-genetics, just for fun. We know that spices in recipes are antipathogens, and people, they analyze many recipes from many countries and many spices, and they show that, for example, when the animal temperature increases, this means the number of parasites increases, the number of spices, this is for 3 examples, but it's true for all of them, the number of spices in recipes increases when you have more parasites in a given country. So, but it is a cultural adaptation to parasites. Okay, so you have many ways to adapt to parasites, and also we have diet adaptation. So spice is kind of a diet adaptation, but there is adaptation, and we'll be fast on this one, for milk. So adult mammals, they cannot drink milk. They drink milk when they are born, after they are they are weaned, and after weaning, they are not able anymore to drink milk because an enzyme just stopped. But in humans, there are few groups who raise animals to take milk, and there have been a selection, a genetic adaptation to be able to drink milk when adults. And this occurred several times, only once in Europe, somewhere here, and this gene, there is only one gene spread all over Europe in 7,000 years. This is the same gene here. It occurs 3 times in Africa, and 1 time in Arabia here with camel milking. And it never occurred in Asia, because in Asia there have never been domestication of an animal to take milk of this animal. and these are several consequences. Okay, so there is local adaptation to be able to drink milk in great quantities. And in America, it's the same as in Asia, because in America, it's the same situation. Okay, milk. There is also an adaptation for starch consumption. With the Neolithic revolution, with agriculture, humans started to eat starch. And the amylase genes get amplified for better digestion of starch. So starch amylase amplification is only in people who went through agriculture. For example, in hunter-gatherer, there is no such amplification. So there is a local adaptation also to the food from the agriculture. This is just for fun. The Japanese are adapted to eat algae. But it's not a genetic on their genome, it's a genetic on the bacteria in their gut. And the bacteria got a gene from a marine bacteria able to digest agar-agar. And because bacteria in the gut are inherited from mother to child, it's also inherited, even if it's not in the genome. But it's inherited and it's selected the same way. Arsenic. In the Atacama Desert, all the water is highly contaminated with arsenic. And the people living there, they have adapted, so they have a special gene, the point mutation, which increase metabolism, faster component expression. So they are genetically adapted to this environment, highly toxic. This is also a very recent publication from last year. Lipids. It's a little bit more complicated, but there are a population in Northern Europe which are adapted to high chain fatty acid and to shorter in Europe. So there are local adaptation for fatty acid consumption, etc., etc. So now, what can we say about this short description of local adaptations? First, just remind that it's only few genes involved. For example, here it's only one gene. Here it's only one gene in Europe. Altitude, well, perhaps 2-3 genes. Here, very few genes. So all this local adaptation was 100 to 200 genes compared to the 23,000 genes in humans. So it's a very tiny fraction, but its importance is very important compared to all the neutral genes. What are the consequences? Well, if you ignore this local adaptation, you can generate health problems. I told you about the skin coloration and that the doctor should complement differently people according to the skin color. But there are many other consequences. For example, there is the globalization of Occidental medicine. Well, this is fine if everyone is the same towards medicine. But this is just one example, a paper showing that, that the cancer evolves differently depending on the ethnic or racial origin of the patient. And there are many recent papers, this is just one, that cancer is very different depending on the geographical origin of people. So probably to cure cancer, well, it must be a different approach depending on the origin of the people. Other example is how drugs are metabolized, and these are several papers showing that, for example, drug oxidation is different depending on geographic or racial differences. This is a systematic review and meta-analysis of ethnic difference in the risk of adverse reaction to drug, etc., etc. And there are many, many papers showing that you cannot ignore the difference among the groups. So there is globalization of medicine, but there is globalization of almost everything. You can buy the the food produced everywhere on Earth. And we've seen that there are local adaptations to diet, globalization of parasites. Many mosquitoes now are everywhere, or bacteria and so on. And this kind of globalization, in presence of local adaptation, will generate health problems by itself. So, this is a quote of a Nobel Prize. This would greatly simplify the understanding of children if we started the study of the living world by the study of evolution. And I'm just copying a little bit this quote and changing it a little bit, and I would say that this would greatly simplify the understanding of adults if we started the study of humanity by studying its local adaptation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Michel, for the great speech. And I would like to invite all the participants to have some question and answer session. First, maybe two first question. Yeah.
Hello, Ahmed is my name. Is the basic mapping of the genome, is it from the project from National Geographic and Geospec? People around the world sending their saliva sample. Is it from that one? And the next is that in the last years there are some the diver who specialize for some minutes under the water, the apnea divers or something like that, means that is not possible because it needs some years or some generation of, as you said, this lung or special container for the air in the body. Is it something like that? Because a new spot there with this apnea divers. Thank you.
Okay, for the first part of the question, I cannot answer because I don't know the result of this National Geographic sampling. If someone knows, for the second part, yeah, the adaptation in the Bajo, it's an adaptation along many generations. For example, if you take all the individuals here and you measure the spleen, all the spleen are not the same size, and some people who have a larger spleen size, and so they could dive a little bit longer. So if you dive a little bit longer, you will take more fish, so you bring back more food, you are advantaged, perhaps you will have more children, and when you repeat this process over many generations, and the Bajo are there since a very long time, little by little you increase spleen size in all the population. And in fact, they sample Bajo people who are not diving because they are too young. They have also a big spleen. This means it's not because you die that your spleen is higher, it's because you are a Bajo that your spleen is higher, and this is a result of selection over many generations. Like the skin color I explained in detail, it takes many generations to change a trait, like skin color, perhaps several centuries, or to change a trait in a population or millennia. And the main example are at least 1 millennia for adaptation to altitude in the Tibet, for example. But yes, the Bajo, it's a long process of advantaging the people with a higher spleen. They reproduce more, and this increases the mean size of the spleen in the population across many generations.
I am a scientist working in Michel Raymond's lab, and I can answer to the first question. So the project Michel was referring to is a project which was which started by public funds. It is an international consortium. I know in the United States it's the NIH. In England it's the Sanger Center, and there is another center in Japan, for instance. And many centers put effort in common to make the genome project. But this project is taking DNA from people and sequencing the whole genome. What you are referring to, the National Geographic one, they refer to some private foundation like 23andMe, and actually they don't sequence the whole genome, they use a simple procedure, and by just checking a few sequences in the genome they can guess the migration and what your ancestor come from. It's not exactly the same. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you. So, any more questions? Yeah.
Hello, good evening. My name is Ari, and I would like to ask you about how does the local adaptation of the people is the significance of their life expectancy. Could you show me with the percentage of the life expectancy in Africa and also in Northern Europe or in the southern areas, something like that? And also, I would like to ask you I would like to know more about three divisions of our race: Caucasoid, Negroid, and Mongoloid. And what's it say? Could we learn is the race divided because of their local adaptations? Thank you.
Well, for the longevity and so on, if you compare longevity in Africa or America, you are comparing things very different because environment is quite different. But if you compare, for example, people adapted or not to a specific environment, you can have differences. For example, if you put people in the Tibetan plateau which are not adapted to altitude, you will see that their longevity and fertility decrease tremendously. Because the probability to get an embolia is very high, and you can die. So there are very few people, non-Sherpa people living at this altitude, and it's the same in Ethiopia and in the Andes. So when you compare people in such extreme environment, with or without the local adaptation, you will see great differences in fertility and longevity. But, for example, if you are European and you want to live in Africa, so you are not protected against UV, but you can put cream, you can put culturally you can compensate. So sometimes, if you know the local adaptation, you can compensate if you can. But for example, if you want to go to live with a Bajo and earn your living by diving and taking fish, either you take bottles and all the technology, the modern technology, but if you don't have the modern technology, you won't be able to eat, because obviously your fishing efficiency will be very, very low. For the second part of your question, I didn't use the word race, because race was used in a very non-scientific way. I'm using groups, techniques, and so on, adaptation. And probably, if you define the difference with local adaptation, which has never been made, the ones which are adapted to a local environment are better than the ones which are not adapted. So you see differences between groups because of the local adaptation and nothing else. So it could be a way to see the differences, because these differences are real and you can define them clearly. And the people locally adapted are better for this type of environment locally. All this talk does not justify the word race. I never used it in my talk.
Okay, maybe I want to ask one more. I would like to know what's it. Could you please give me one example that race or ethnic that could flexible when living in many conditions? Then, for example, this is an example there. If people who live in Himalayan, they could live in any more place, something like they go to Indonesia, or after that they could adapt in Russia or something like that. Do you find any the tribes or race that could live?
Well, we know that if you want to go to live with the Sherpa in the Himalaya, we will have problems. What we less know is that if the Sherpa they are living at the sea level, if they have problems. From what I've read, yes, there are some problems on the other way. In the Andes, the people going living near the sea, they feel bad and they want to go back to the high altitude. But this aspect is less studied, in fact.
Okay, thank you.
Any more question?
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Ramo. It's fully interesting talk. My name is Pai. I'm also I have an interest in population genetics. I've been doing research in population genetics as well. I have two questions. Very interesting research that you've done in Merapi. But I'm wondering, how did you measure risk? Is there any kind of markers or biomarkers that you can get? And then the second one, because the Merapi people, they're living in a high altitude, but it's not as high as the Himalayas. But have you found any kind of adaptation in their genetic, like the IPS1 gene or other genes like in Himalaya? Thank you.
Okay, risk has been measured by economic games. So the economists have several games to measure many aspects of behavior, and in particular behavior toward risk. So an example is that you take an individual and you say, I will give you, for example, $3, and you can put a part of that on a personal place or on a risky place. On the risky place, it will be multiplied by 3. You flip a coin, so it's either multiplied by 3 or it disappears. And after you add the two results and you get this money. So if you put everything on the safe place, you get everything. If you put everything on the risky place, you can get nothing, or it's multiplied by 3, for example. So the percentage of what is put on the risky place is a measure of how people behave toward this risky game. So it's a quantitative measure. This is one example, and there are several games. But this is one example of how to measure what people will do and if they are confident with the risk or not. Okay, and in fact, people living in the risky environment, they put very little. So they are risk averse. They don't, in this kind of game, they put very little, and they put less than people living just outside. Well, it depends on the genetic composition, in fact. But this is one way to measure the risk. So it's a quantitative measure.
Okay. So you have serotype data as well, or haplotype, or sequence data, something like that.
And on this preliminary experiment, we just analyzed at these dopamine receptor genes, the different alleles, and we measure the risk, and we correlate if the the behavior towards the risk was correlated with the genes or with the place where the people were. And the gene explained more than the place. So yeah, it was a genetic adaptation, and the allele is in higher frequency on the risky area. But the difference is 10%. It's not, it's significant, but there are some migration between the two, but still, there is a difference in the genetic frequencies.
I'm sorry, the second question is that, have you found any evidence like in Himalayas, the EPAS1 or...
Yeah, we didn't search for,
okay.
And we didn't even sample the high altitude populations in Europe.
Okay.
Yeah, we have no data on that.
Yeah, interesting discussion. Any more questions, ladies and gentlemen? No more question?
I can try one. Shall we know that in societies which are renowned for being fierce warriors, the best warriors have advantages in terms of reproduction success. They have more wives, they have more children. Did you observe any kind of genetic predisposition coming out from this selection of the best warriors in the society, especially in Papua, for instance?
Yeah, this is a very interesting suggestion, but to my knowledge, no one has tried to see if there is a genetic adaptation to be a fierce warrior. And this could be something interesting because they have more children, so all the conditions for natural selection is there. So yeah, very good point.
No more question? Yeah, sorry. So yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Raymond, for the presentation and the question and answer session. It was a very interesting session. And thank you very much for your coming. I would like to remind you that you could have some snack outside, and you could also discuss with Mr. Raymond directly outside. And there will be a next conference in November in the transportation of Indonesia. You have the brochure outside. Until then, goodbye.